Hello and welcome to this N4 webinar. This is about GDPR and securing your data. My name is John Williams. I'm the Senior Product Manager here at N4, and with me is Vicky Withy. She's the Compliance Manager and all things to do with GDPR. So between the two of us, we're going to take you through this webinar, which today is going to discuss providing an insight into some of the GDPR articles which pertain to data security. So we're not looking at GDPR, every single element of it. What we've done is sort of pulled out the elements that pertain to the GDPR data security elements. And we're going to have a look at those and look at some breaches that have happened in the past. And we're going to talk about how that would play out in a GDPR world when the legislation comes into play, and how we might have prevented it. So we're going to look, it's always good to look back in retrospect, I know, but look at how those companies that were affected by those breaches might have protected themselves a little bit better. So we're going to try and link some of the solutions that N4 provide around security, etc., to some of those GDPR articles. Now, we have a booklet that we've done, which the link that you can see there, if you haven't downloaded it already, then I'd recommend that you do so. It sort of talks in greater detail about those articles, and also in greater detail about the solutions that we feel that will be able to help with that GDPR protection. So please download that either if you haven't done so now after the webinar. So great, let's get started.
So I think first of all, it's important really to understand what GDPR is all about. If you've been not with us for the last 18 months, it's really about protecting people's personal identifiable information that they hold. So GDPR really strengthens the Data Protection Act that currently is already in place. It's also important to note, so who's going to monitor all of this as well? So that's going to be the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office. So they're going to be monitoring, handling complaints from the public, dealing with data breaches and investigating those. Obviously companies will have to make sure that they have a link with the ICO anyway, so that they know what's going on should you ever suffer a data breach of any kind. GDPR at the end of the day is there really to strengthen people's rights about how companies protect personal identifiable information that companies hold. It's about protecting the rights and freedoms of natural persons. That's the legal definition that's in place. It also places duties really upon organisations to protect data subjects' rights, and data subjects is just you and I, is an individual. And again, you can, organisations are going to have to make sure that they show due diligence in how they're going to protect information by doing data protection impact assessments, understanding and putting in place processes around data breach reporting, and also grappling with understanding what the fines are all about as well, because it's not just about the big 4% annual global turnover fine or up to 20 million euros. It's also about understanding the particular articles that relate to protecting security of data, and when protecting those, that the potential fines for those will also be at 2% as well, and people don't really talk about that a great deal. And just not just about fines, there's also other things that the ICO will put in place as well, such as warnings and rectification notices and general penalties for not adhering to the new regulations. So there is a very wide scope as well, so of different kinds of penalties that companies could be open to. If not the most severe, there's still going to be lots of penalties in place that companies really need to be aware of. So, what are the new rights of individuals? Well, data subjects, you and I as individuals, have 8 new rights. We have the right basically to information, the right to access that information. When the information is held about as incorrect, we have the right to rectification. In some circumstances, we could also have, the right to erasure. We can also ask for people to stop processing our data as well. Data portability is also a consideration. So should you have any automated processes within your businesses, looking at data portability might be something that you need to consider. You could have a right to objection, or a full stop, a revision of automation about how decisions become made. A good example of this is, for example, when doing a credit check and you might have something incorrect on your file and that's being processed. You could disagree with how a company actually credits or looks at your credit file and actually ask them to revise and not consider the automated process but actually go through that process manually. Again, this is GDPR really flexing its muscles and giving back the individual the power to understand what's happening with their data. With this, there's 6 new accounting principles. Under the current Data Protection Act, there are 8 data protection rules. Under GDPR, there is 6 under accountability, and really these are just a quick summary, and it's about the purpose and limitation of how we hold this information. It's about data minimisation, so we're not collecting data that we shouldn't be actually collecting. We're only collecting what is relevant and what we actually need. It's about the accuracy of that data. A lot of organisations hold a lot of data out there, and some of it is actually really old and incorrect and not even valid anymore. Storage and limitation. Again, companies are being asked to really think about and how they tell their customers and their clients about how long they're keeping that information for, and how they're going to process it in a particular way. Integrity and confidentiality. Of course, there's a big onus on this about organisations making sure they have proper employment terms and conditions for staff when working with data, that data is secure in their IT facilities, and looking at mechanisms in which to protect that data to maintain confidentiality, integrity and availability of information. And all at the end of the day, you have to have whatever happens on a lawful basis to hold this information, be it through an opt-in process or maybe a legitimate concern as to the reason why you need to process and actually have this personal identifiable information within your organisation. So I think it's important to see, isn't it, that there are 11 articles really that pertain specifically to security and securing information. And so I'm just going to quickly talk through 3 of the articles which are really relevant in actually bringing out the idea of protecting information. This is GDPR saying to all businesses, you need to protect information, full stop. So Article 25 is all about protection by design and by default. So what's it really saying? Well, it's actually saying if you are the control of that data, you need to consider and implement appropriate measures to secure your data. And it needs to be a consideration every time you look at collecting personal identifiable information. So, and you need to understand that you're only going to use that information for the specific purpose in which you're collecting it for. You can't collect information about, for example, what's your favourite colour or your favourite pizza, unless, of course, you're wanting to know that information for a very specific reason. You can't actually get information you shouldn't be collecting. So that's Article 25. Article 32. Now, this is a huge article, and I'm going to try and give you a quick, brief summary of this article, broken down into 5 different steps. So first of all, Article 32 is, again, that you need to consider as a business how you're going to implement appropriate technical measures to ensure that you maintain level of security. At the end of the day, it's all about mitigation of risk, isn't it,
Yes,
John?
absolutely.
So You need to maintain confidentiality, integrity and availability of that information, which again are the core principles going back to the accounting principles under GDPR. You need to make sure that you don't have accidental or unlawful destruction, loss or alteration, unauthorised disclosure of, or access to personal data. So again, it's about protecting that information. How you consider how you're going to do that, you know, is depending on what information you've got and who's got access to it, how you may be transmitting that data across the organisation, internally or externally. You need to consider how you're going to process that information to make sure that you're not going to fall foul of being able to give accidental lawful destruction, loss or alteration in any way. You know, information has to be processed in a manner, but it also, whatever mechanisms you consider in your business to use to secure your data, you need to make sure that you constantly review, test and assess to make sure that it's really fit for purpose. There's a lot of information out there about how you can protect data, and a lot of businesses have taken on security measures to help protect information and protect against email or DDoS attacks. But, you know, is it relevant for your organisation, and is it actually fit for purpose? If it's really old, it might not be actually doing the job that you think it's actually doing. So a full review of your environment and how you're going to protect your data really needs to be taken place, especially with IT specialists in your organisation. If you don't have IT specialists, you know, then that's where we come in, and hopefully we can able to help you understand where your risks are in your business and how you can protect your environment. So Article 33 is about the notification of personal data breaches to the supervisory authority. This is really important to understand because this is a massive step change for organisations. Basically, if you have a data breach of any kind, you're only going to have 72 hours after becoming aware of it where you actually can report a data breach. And 72 hours is not a long time, especially if you have a data breach on a Friday evening or over a weekend or a bank holiday period, when highly likely that these are more vulnerable times when you might expect such attacks or data breaches to actually occur. You really do need to have something in place that enables you to follow a process and understand how you're going to communicate this, both with internal members of staff, also externally with the ICO, and also potentially those who've been affected by the data breach as well. And you know, Article 33 goes on to say about how you should notify the controller and that you must have no undue delay. It also says that you need to describe the measures taken or proposed to be taken by the controller to address personal data breaches, which is really important because it's all about mitigation. If there's one thing that you take away from today, it's understanding, you know, what the risks are in your business around looking after that personal data, and also looking at how you can mitigate those risks. So you can really prevent a data breach, you know, from occurring. Nobody's going to be 100% fail-safe proof, but the ICO have said if you've put in as much protection as you can around protecting personal data, obviously it's going to stack much favourably in your favour, really, because you've done everything possible that you can to protect yourself, your data subjects, and your organisation. You know, Article 34 is all about communication of a personal data breach to the data subject. And it's looking at when a personal data breach is likely to result in high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. And it's also looking at the controller and has it implemented the appropriate technical measures. Again, it's about understanding your risk and putting the appropriate technical mitigation strategies in place to protect your business, protect people's information.
Yeah, so key to this is sort of design and organising your security. So just to sort of go back a little bit, and I think you have to have the attitude that you will be breached, because you've got to have a process in place to do that 72 hours to say how you're going to do it. So it's no good saying, right, I'm going to throw all this money at something and I'm not going to get breached. I think you have to come with the attitude that at some stage you will be breached. This is about mitigating the risk, as we've already said. There is no tick in the box for GDPR compliance. It is a set of regulations that you've got to be aware of, and that you've got to basically, like an insurance policy, make sure that you've done everything that you can within legitimate reason to mitigate that risk. And therefore, when a breach does occur, then the ICO are going to say, right, well, this guy is actually, or this company has done their very best, therefore we will not fine them XYZ because they have done their very best to mitigate that risk. So data was leaked, but that data was encrypted, for instance, or this was breached, but we had this X, Y, and Z in place to actually mitigate against that, there was we have done all we can to do it. So, yes, designing your security to fit the data that you hold, and there is not a one-stop shop for this. Organisations will have different levels of security they need to put in, dependent upon the business that they're in and the data that they hold. So you've got to think about what you are protecting. You've got to look at, do you need all the data that you're holding? And maybe you need to get rid of some of the data that you've got. You need to be considering is what the risk is if there is a data breach, and having those processes in place in order to talk to the ICO and talk to your customers about it. And you need to understand what security you have in place in order to protect data. So some of the key factors that I've looked at recently in data security, many organizations are now looking internally at their skill sets, and they're saying, well, actually, we don't have those skill sets in-house to manage that security. So maybe we should be either looking to outsource this type of security and get experts in who do understand it. So that's a real concern of organisations in a recent survey that Pomon did in February of this year. And really there's a lack of visibility around having all this layered security in place. We've put all this, we spent this money, we've put solution X, solution Y, and solution Z in place. But how do I know they're working? How do I know that I'm getting value for money on those applications, those layers that I put in place? And so, having that visibility of that risk is quite important. And one of the biggest risks, if you talk about, some of the breaches that have gone on, is that lack of staff awareness. Yes, we've put these things in place, but emails still come through to people with links that if staff are not aware that they shouldn't be clicking, URLs embedded into emails, that they have potentially disastrous consequences. If they don't have that awareness, then all the protection in the world isn't going to stop your staff from exposing you to extra risks. So I wanted to go through a few sort of examples that we have here of some of the breaches that we've had recently in the UK. I wanted to focus in on the UK because obviously we're in the UK and there are plenty around the world and many in America. But Clarksons are a massive shipping organisation that in November of last year had an initial breach. They're the world's largest shipbroker. They found that they were contacted by a hacker who said that they had a load of their data, and that if Clarksons didn't pay a substantial fee to the hacker, then they would release the information onto the dark web. So it's a bit it wasn't ransomware, but it was blackmail in terms of releasing this information out to the dark web. So they immediately engaged with a company called Colocation to manage their liability. They got in contact with solicitors. Their share price went down by about 2% after a statement to the stock exchange, and then they found the account that had been breached, and they quickly disabled it. But horses bolted after the stable door, as it were, and they didn't. They then said that they weren't going to pay up the ransom, and so as far as I know, that data is still hanging as to whether it's going to be released or not. So the way that happens is the cyber criminal breaches the account either by some form of brute force password, and they then exfiltrate the data that they want to get, and they have then exfiltrated it via FTP or email, or however they did it, and then demand the ransom over. So, I mean, when we come to GDPR, Vicky, what sort of penalty would they see for that?
So this is working on the current principles and the regulations it stands, that under Article 5, which are the main accounting principles, that processing data in an appropriate manner probably wasn't adhered to. So potentially Clarkson's could have been maybe fined up to 4% of annual global turnover because they weren't actually processing data securely and they weren't maintaining security around that data. And then they could potentially be fined again under Article 24/32 as well. Again, about the fact that it's the responsibility of the controller to maintain the security of that information. And that they must protect personal identifiable information, and again they didn't take the appropriate level of security into consideration, which then led to them being open to this breach in the first place.
Absolutely. So what could they have done in terms of prevention? Well, at a sort of a mass level, they could have used some sort of SIEM service. SIEM stands for Security Information Event Management. So they could have used something like our N4Threat Detect to spot those brute force password attacks against those user accounts. So something like a SIEM service analyzes what's going on inside your network and spots anomalous behavior. So if somebody fails to log in to an account 3 times, then we can put that usually down to a user forgetting their password and just getting it right on the 3rd attempt. But a system that analyzes and sees that there's been 500 or 1,000 attempts at a user account will then automatically be alerted to the fact that something somewhere is trying to get into those password accounts, into those user accounts, and that's very important in terms of finding what is going on before it's actually happened, so that you can actually stop it. We call it breaking the chain, the threat code chain. In terms of discovering these things and acting upon them before they actually become a problem. One of the other things they could have done is they could have marked the data that they have with a technology called data leak prevention. Now that marks that and gives it a signature that will not allow it to leave the environment either through the firewall or through endpoints. So they could have done something like that through, again, N4Protect plus like a next generation firewall type technology. And of course they could have encrypted the data. Had they encrypted the data in some way, then had they not used any of those other solutions, the data when it left the organization wouldn't have been readable.
Yeah.
And again, they could have hashed it, salted it, etc., through encryption technology to make sure that if it leaves, it's not going to be usable. So let's look at another type of breach here, Bupa Global. In fact, in July of last year, had a data breach, and it was actually an employee of the health insurance division who took some data and basically sent it out. I don't know whether the person sold it on or whether he himself was the hacker, but somebody called Mozil, who posted all this data on Alpha Bay site on the dark web, advertising 1 million exclusive medical database records across 122 countries, which Bupa were at pains to point out. Sheldon Kenton, their managing director, did a video statement and reported the breach to the ICO. Said that it didn't affect anybody in the UK. That this was global around the rest of the world, particularly. So here we have something that is internal in terms of. It's not an external breach, it's an external breach. But again, Vicky, what would be the penalties for that?
Okay, so again, really, we're looking at again, coming back to the main accounting principles, the 6 accounting principles here, you could find that Bupa could be open up to a fine under processing of an appropriate, not following an appropriate manner for securing data. So they could have been open potentially to, again, 4% annual global turnover, but Bupa are a massive company. Article 24, again, the responsibility is about the data controller maintaining security. And given the fact that this is a human, an individual, an employee who's actually caused this data breach, and it isn't somebody from the outside going into the environment, it's actually somebody who, is somebody in your workplace is quite worried. So it's all about how you might what controls you might put in place to ensure that employees just can't walk off with personal identifiable information in this manner. So Article 24 could be up for consideration, and also Article 32, the fact that it wasn't assessed, the risks around personal sensitive information, medical information being highly sensitive anyway. Again, Bupa didn't consider this, and this would definitely come under ICO's radar of definitely a 2% annual global turnover potential situation, or up to a €10 million fine.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
It is serious.
So if we look at how they might have prevented that, again, there's the data leak protection type technology where you're going to flag particular data that you don't want it to leave. But probably more important around there would be some database management, actually making sure that the right people have access, or more to the point, that the wrong people don't have access to database information, database data, that the rights of the individual of users is correctly set, proportionate to the data that they're managing. So we have database management services, and as I said, the data leak protection, and again, basic data encryption would have said that when that data was exfiltrated out into the wild, it would have been useless.
Yeah.
Because of the encryption that they get. So one of the last one that I'm going to look at here is a business email compromise. So just last year, around September, there were a number of art dealers in Mayfair, London, breached. One of them was the Laura Bartlett Gallery. She was one of 9 art dealers who were affected by this business email compromise. And what happened basically is that an email account was compromised, somebody got access to it, they were able to go in and forward emails to an anonymous mailbox so that they could monitor the types of emails that were being sent. And when they found an email purporting to an invoice for a very large sale that Laura Bartlett's gallery had done that year, they actually then intercepted that and put their own banking details within that email. So they substituted the email with their own banking details and sent that out to the purchaser to actually sell it. And it was such a big amount of money for a small gallery like that. It actually has that business is no longer in existence. That business is gone. She couldn't make that business work after losing all that money. So the UK is actually one of the top 5 countries in the world for business email compromise attacks, and that's not just a measure of the attack successes, I have to say. It's a measure of the number of attacks that are going on throughout the
And I think they're on the general increase as well,
absolutely,
aren't they?
yeah. I mean, we you hear about people sending emails for invoices, and it's about compromising those email accounts. And it's so easy to find people's email addresses and then be able to go and attempt to guess what the password is, or to do a brute force attack against those passwords in order to get in and then compromise, take over that account. We ran an event yesterday where our chief technologist was going through some of the tools that hackers generally use, and it just showing you what is generally available on the web, to be able to tools to just find all the emails that are available for an organization, and then you can just go through them one by one and create some script to brute force attack them. It really is easy pickings. It's not as difficult as people think. So again, what would the penalties really for that type of breach?
Again, it comes back to the 6 accounting principles, first of all, because that's the one that has the most major breach, major fine around it. Is again about processing data in an appropriate manner to maintain security. And again, 4% annual global turnover. There's a consistent theme here around all about preventing things from happening, mitigating those risks, and protecting information here. Article 25, again, protecting information to be considered by design and default. The controller really needed to think about, this scenario, potentially happening. Unfortunately, she didn't, and neither did some of the other art galleries as well that were involved in the same breach. And that's really sad. But that again, they didn't see themselves as a target. I think the problem is a lot of people don't see themselves as a target in business.
Absolutely.
And actually that assumption should be just wrong. You really,
yes, it doesn't
this
matter
is
how
really
big
important.
or small you are.
Every organisation will have a finance department. Everybody will need to process an invoice or have money coming into their organisation or pay people. So this is a big deal. This is something that can happen very easily. So Article 32, the processing for making sure that whatever you do put in place, that you test, assess and evaluate to make sure that those mechanisms and mitigation strategies that you put in place to prevent such events happening, you're actually testing them, or do live scenario testing to see, could this happen to you? So like business continuity planning does. People worry about a plane landing on their business and what would happen in that event. What people aren't considering, or a lot of businesses aren't considering out there, is what would happen if they have some sort of brute force attack on their organisation in an electronic world. So this really does need highlighting. I think only 32% of businesses out there at the moment are actually still aware of GDPR and are actually actively doing something about it in their business to actually put better security mechanisms in place.
So I mean, in terms of what she could have done to prevent that, again, services like Threat Detect, where we're going to be looking at her network or inside her network to be able to detect what is going on, would have been good. But simple things like understanding, having two-factor authentication on her password, so that she's not just using a normal password, she's got some other type of two-factor authentication, would have, for a small business like that, would equally have been a good measure to actually work. So, there are lots of things that, depending on what size of the company you are, that you can do. I've sort of got an idea of what 3 steps that I've put forward here on closing sort of the door to breaches. And really the first one for me is you need to understand what it is, where you are starting. We all have this layered security that we talk about. So by layered security, I'm talking about we've got a firewall in place, we've got some antivirus in place, we've got some web authentication in place, in blacklisting or whitelisting of websites that we want our staff to go to or not to go to. So we have these layers of security. But how do we know they work? How do we know that they're being effective? So understanding what you've got and where you're from by doing some sort of vulnerability test. Now, that can be an external vulnerability test if you've got websites that you've got, or it could be an inside vulnerability test looking at the internal network and having a look. But getting a baseline really of where you are and understanding, yes, I've got this, that and the other, but that's not being effective because clearly from this vulnerability test I can see that other things are going on. So understanding and baselining your security so that you can actually put effective layers in place is key to this.
So it's all about detection, really, isn't it? In that
Well,
first point is vulnerability.
It's about detection before something nasty is going to happen. It's making sure that what you think you've got in place that is protecting your network actually is fit for purpose and does work. So the other thing I've got to talk here is a unified threat management. If you're a large organisation and you've got multiple platforms scattered, either on public cloud, private cloud, on virtual machines somewhere, having a unified threat management where you are creating a policy or allowing a company like N4 to create those policies for you and disseminate those across your entire environment, making sure you have a consistent platform. And lastly, running some form of SIEM reporting. So this is N4Threat Detect. It is a system that does a whole load of internal analysis and give you a risk factor on particular elements within your organization. A key thing in terms of running this sort of thing. So I can see that we've got a few questions coming in.
Yeah.
I've just got a slide up here that shows you what sort of solutions that we're looking at.
So one of the first questions is, do we need to register with the ICO? Yes, the answer is yes. You should. For a small organisation, it's not very expensive. So I think it's like £35 to £40 a year annual registration fee. It doesn't matter whether you have one person or 500 people. You know, if you're handling personal identifiable information, you should be registered with the ICO. Next question is, what is considered a reasonable time period to hold personal data on paper and by email?
That's a very good question, and I think it depends on what business you're in, and there will be rules for the financial sector that are different from the car sector or a manufacturing sector.
Yeah, so for example, HMRC, if you're keeping payroll data, you really need to keep that information for 7 years, HMRC will say. But if you need to keep records around contractual purposes, you may keep them for as long as that contract is in existence, and then after that, you might not need to keep it up until a certain point. I mean, the general rule of thumb is for contractual purposes, you have 6 years where somebody can make any claim against a company on legal grounds. So you might want to consider that. So the retention period is very different depending on what it is really that you're keeping that information for. I think you have to understand what it is that you're trying to keep.
And I think the key is you need to inform the people that you have got the information on that you are going to hold it for this long. Now, if they have objections, as long as they've signed up for that, then that's part and parcel of the due diligence you need to do in holding that data.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we've got that little booklet that I have mentioned earlier. I would urge you to download it. We're also doing, as part of this webinar, an offer to do some vulnerability testing. So we've got a voucher. I would stress it's a day's worth of engineers' time to do some vulnerability tests, or either inside your network or outside your network. It's certainly not both, because that would take more than 2 days to do. But you can choose to analyse your internal network or your external network, and we've got a voucher here that's valid for until the end of
June.
Up to the end of May, isn't it? So the beginning of June, to run with this. So that's something that you can sign up for and get. Just come to our website for that.
And that's it.
And that's about it, really. If there's any more questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, we'll sign off. And thank you very much for listening.